Chris Anthony, and welcome to Uncloaked Illusions. And I decided to share a particular thought that I've been having for quite some time, and I've even had conversations with it, maybe even semi-debates about the Black community, primarily the identity. This was an interesting conversation I recall having with someone a few days ago. And that question was posed to me of what does it actually mean to be Black and proud, and what are you proud of? And I try to give my interpretation of what it possibly means and if or not this particular race is actually proud. This is why the identity crisis issue is a major issue, and it should be a focal point to pay attention to, because the Black woman, especially the new age Black woman, has been for quite some time since arriving on the shores of America, has been literally integrating and borrowing aspects of other cultures' imagery. And you can't explain that to them. They won't accept it. Why do you see most Black women with weave? You know, mind you, this is how disturbing that is, because weave, let's say hair, it actually has the DNA of that particular person interwoven in the hair. So in truth, you're putting DNA of another person's hair in your own. But then you want me to believe that you love yourself. You want me to believe that you're proud of something. You're proud of yourself. I pose this question, and I'm asking, how can you be proud of something that you have absolutely no idea of what it could possibly be, meaning your identity? You don't know what your identity is because it's been demonized since you arrived on the shores of the American land. So ultimately, I think it's funny when you you appropriate other culture styles to your own, and then you want to spew the rhetoric that they're stealing your style. And I love the whole outcry of the queens and the kings, and I maintain this, especially looking at history. When it comes to queens and kings, no, you did not come from kings or queens in Africa. Okay, if you were sold in Africa for the most part, your ancestors arrived here during the slave trade, and they were sold by the kings, by royalty. Okay? Follow along with that. They were sold for rum and weaponry, maybe even the manufacturing goods that the Europeans possessed at that particular moment. And the people that were sold were criminals, debtors, or they were criminals, I believe, or prisoners of war from rivaling tribes. So you were not kings and queens ancestral wise if you ended up in America. And mind you, in truth, only 5% ended up in America. Brazil, I believe, got 41%, and the Caribbean got 41%. So again, all of the madness, all of the hyperbolized ideology of how this all came about came off of a lie. Your kings sold you. Your queens sold you. And when you parade around here pretending to be kings and queens, I'm sorry, kings, queens, royalty, don't behave like that. But you're convinced you are, acting like a savage, and then trying to identify as some sort of royalty. I wonder what type of royalty you are in line with. Now, I digress. Back to the identity issue. You have Black women that literally are ashamed, and not all, but majority and majority rules, are ashamed of their African heritage. Instead, they love to spout the whole notion of, I've never been to Africa. Yeah, you haven't been to Africa. But how about you learn something about the African nation, the African continent? And maybe look into what tribe you came from, because there's literally over 800 tribes in Africa, maybe, I believe, 1,000 different languages. And these people communicate with each other. And they can speak many different languages, and yet you can't even master speaking the English language. It's telling. Now, one thing that also it's a major metastasized disease and issue in our community is mental illnesses. Mental illnesses is something that Black people have stigmatized, demonized even, and they just will not accept nor acknowledge that it exists. ADHD, psychosis, APD, arrested psychological development, depression, anxiety, and the list goes on. Because these mental issues or these mental, well, it's not considered mental, but these behavioral issues are chopped down, cut down, denied, and they're not acknowledged, then there's actually no true healing that can happen in the Black community, because we can't even acknowledge that these things exist. Instead, we have a culture that makes fun and mock people that have any kind of disability, whether it be physical, whether it be psychological, emotional. We will literally mock the people. Or we will also just become so accepting and it being normalized that we overlook it and we don't think much of it. So in truth, we have allowed our culture to become completely hollowed out and decadent. And really, there's no excuse, especially when you have a great deal of Black women, men as well, boasting of how they're educated because they have this sheet of paper that basically says they've passed some courses. And that does not solidify intelligence. It doesn't. But if you allow them to continue with the rhetoric, you'll believe that, oh, maybe they are. But I don't believe, and this is just in my opinion, I don't believe educated people act like savages. I don't believe that educated people act animalistic. I don't believe that educated people lack any kind of intellect or any kind of emotional intelligence. Black people have a tendency to lack those things and get very, very upset, offended even. That's if they know what it is. When you point out these particular behavior traits that they possess. Can't get them to pick up a book. Speaking of book, I am going to give my analysis of a particular book I read called Tyranny by, I believe his name is Snyder. I know the last name is Snyder. I can't remember the name entirely at this point. It's definitely about history, Nazi Germany, even Stalin, Russian, USSR, totalitarianisms, and the things that led up to this particular event. World War II, Germany being overtaken by socialist communism, and what is that? Russia. Needless to say, I digress. I'll take care of that when necessary. But I do pose that question. What exactly do you consider your identity to be? Do you know anything of the origins of your identity, or does it even matter to you? I vehemently believe and feel that these conversations are conversations that need to commence in the Black community, because the healing process cannot start. It cannot even come about if we can't even acknowledge There's issues. And one major issue is the psychological issues that we possessed throughout slavery that's pretty much metastasized from generation to generation. I always try to argue the point of this had been something that had existed in Africa even before, the mid 1400s. And this was more of a tribal, issue. Violence was rampant even then, as it was throughout the world with any culture. Tribalism is something that exists, and dominating another tribe and taking their resources and their property, and humans can also be considered as property. This is something that's been taking place since time immemorial. So it's the issue in modern day America, in modern day Black communities, is we won't acknowledge these things that exist. We won't even acknowledge the very basic things that we can possibly do something about that really shouldn't even cost any money. And that is actually sit down and have conversations with each other. Actually talk about the mental illnesses, the depression, the anxiety, the psychosis, okay? The trauma that inhibits people from mentally developing. We can't even discuss these things. But then we want to cry white supremacy. Funny. We want to cry racism. I hear racism spouted so much now to the point where the word, it garners no significance anymore because everything now can be racist. I pose these questions and I give this perspective in hopes that it will open up a dialogue where we can have a conversation and maybe we can explore the origins of our identities before we even arrived, or our ancestors, arrived on the American shores. And that's also something to really consider. Only 5% of the slaves made it to America, North America. South America got 41%, and Brazil, and the Caribbeans got 41% as well. So maybe that's something that we need to consider. Also consider the fact that your ancestors were not queens, they were not kings. Stop touting bullshit, because it keeps you locked in this particular mindset and you live in this fantasy world. You create your reality based on fantasy. Your ancestors were sold by kings and queens due to the fact of rum, manufactured goods, and weaponry. Because you were either your ancestors were considered to be criminals, debtors, or they were prisoners of war. And from tribes, that was a rivalry. So let's get out of the whole idea of coming from kings and queens, which I find it to be hilarious. I'm going to go on that. When I hear the men talking about, we were kings, we came. No, you didn't. Stop it. You make yourself look even more pathetic and ridiculous when that's a narrative that you're living on. I'm Chris Anthony, and I'm out.